Let's talk more about moral distress. Just a quick reminder of what the definition is of moral distress. Moral distress occurs when we take an action or we witness an action that violates our inner values. And we accept that all of our inner values, they're not all the same. We have different inner values. So what matters to me might be different than what matters to you. And so that means that something bad could happen that bothers you, but doesn't bother me as much, or vice versa. So what is inside of us, and those values come from lots of places, of course: our upbringing, our culture, our religious background, our personality, our experience of what we've seen before. So whatever those values are that live inside of us, moral distress happens when we see something that's going contrary to that. Sometimes it's one thing. This event happened, and that one we're going to talk about one of those. Sometimes it's a system. Sometimes it's a policy that goes against our values. Sometimes it's just a cultural thing that's happening within our midst that goes against those values. So let's talk about some examples there. So going back to the beginning of the pandemic, this is a story about moral distress for me, and that I think just really shows easily some of what it feels like to experience moral distress. So if you remember at the beginning of the pandemic, whether you were in healthcare at that point or not, you'll remember that nursing homes, hospitals, other healthcare facilities went to a zero visitor policy. And I was at the large health system that I worked for at the time, as a department director, as the chairperson of the ethics committee. I was one of the people that was looked to say, should we be doing this? Should we go to a zero visitor policy? And so when we looked at what was going on, I did recommend, like most, that we would go to a zero visitor policy, where we would not allow any visitors in, even really in the most dire circumstances, which you know what that resulted in. It resulted in people who died in the hospital or in nursing homes who didn't have their loved ones with them and were only accompanied by healthcare coworkers and not by their friends and family. So I made that recommendation because I felt like that was the right thing to do at that point in time. I still would look back and say, I wish we hadn't done that, but it probably was based on the information that we had at the time. So I was asked for my opinion. I gave that opinion, and then our health system still did not move to the zero visitor policy right away. Now, that was a time when a day felt like a week or a month. So I don't think the delay, in retrospect, when I think about it, probably wasn't that long, but it felt long at the time. And so I felt like I'm the chairperson of the ethics committee for this large health system. This is what my recommendation is. And then our executives asked me to come back with recommendation from the entire ethics committee to poll everyone. Well, I'd had conversations with most of them, and I knew where they stood, but we did put that out to the entire committee. And with 100%, a 100% unanimous return, they felt as though it was time to go to this zero visitor policy. But there was a gap there where our hospital still wasn't ready to do that. And so this caused moral distress for me for at least 3 reasons. First of all, the ethics committee was ignored briefly, and I wasn't used to that. I was in my value system. If the ethics committee makes a recommendation, that recommendation should be followed, not because we're smarter or better or authoritative, but because it's a well thought through recommendation. So there was a values dissonance there for me because we weren't listened to exactly. Second of all, I just felt badly about making that recommendation. Of course, I think everyone who said, let's go to a zero visitor policy, felt badly about making that recommendation. After all, one of the departments that I led was the chaplaincy department. What chaplains do in a hospital setting a lot of times is they were the ones making the call to family and friends saying, hey, can you come to the hospital? Can you be here with this patient, with your loved one, that sort of thing. So it was a total reversal of our normal value set, where we're trying to get people to be there at the hospital, and now we're the ones saying, no, you cannot come here. Third of all, and this was later, about a year later, our state enacted a law that said we would never be able to go to a zero visitor policy again. So even in retrospect, even after things started to change, I felt badly. I had some moral distress because I realized that I had been a part of enacting something that now is illegal in our state. So I usually try to follow the laws, and so that caused a little bit of, sort of in retrospect, some moral distress for me as well. So that's an example of, things that lived internally in me that either we violated, I violated, or I saw violated during that time. So let's go in a more clinical direction for nurses. We had a patient, and we ended up having multiple patients like this over time. We had a patient many years ago who was elderly, frail. You know as well as I do that just because a person's older doesn't necessarily mean that they're frail and weak and that sort of thing. But the two, of course, can go hand in hand, and they went hand in hand for this patient. She was very sick. She had necrosis of the brain, so parts of her brain tissue were dying. She was not brain dead, but parts of her brain were dying. She had metastasized cancer all through her body, just sort of everywhere. She'd been nonverbal, not able to communicate with her family, with our staff. She'd been at our facility, which was a hospital and an intensive care environment. She'd been there for weeks, not able to communicate with anyone. She was in multi-organ failures. Her kidneys were shutting down. Her heart was struggling. Her lungs were not keeping up. She was therefore, of course, vent dependent. That vent was keeping her going. So you've probably seen patients like this, very frail, everything starting to shut down. What that state looks like and what's coming. But in this case, the family wanted to keep their loved one a full code and demanded that the care team do absolutely everything that could possibly be done for her to preserve her life. Now, if you're a nurse caring for a patient like this, and perhaps you've had experiences like this yourself, if you're a nurse caring for this patient and you know what's coming, and yet the family is asking you to go full court press and do everything you possibly can to preserve the life of this patient for as long as possible, including CPR, resuscitation, pushing of meds if her heart were to stop, you know that if her heart were to stop, even if you were successful doing CPR, it's not going to stop the necrosis of the brain, the multi-organ failure, it's not going to reverse the cancer diagnosis. And so you might feel internally like this would be the wrong thing to do to code this patient. So of course, this became an ethics consult, and they got other people involved. But the bottom line was she's a very sick person who remained as a full code. And so for nurses and aides and physicians and respiratory therapists and everybody who was taking care of her, when they came to work, they came with a sense of dread of what if this patient codes and then we have to perform CPR and all the things that go along with CPR. Well, unfortunately, that is exactly what happened. And this patient lost her pulses because she was a full code. Our team swung into action, performed CPR, the respirations, the medicine, the whole 9 yards. Of course, it happened late at night when there was only one family member there. That family member was not the decision maker. She was a granddaughter of this patient. So she was in agony as she watched her grandma be in agony and saw even tears on the faces of the care team as they felt as though they were doing something. Many of them, I think, felt as though they were doing something that violated their own values. This is what it feels like to experience moral distress. When you feel like you're doing something or watching something that's just not right. And when we violate those things inside of us, we do so at a cost. And when that cost isn't acknowledged or recognized or dealt with, it can lead to worse things and certainly to burnout. So just that quick reminder, the definition, moral distress, when you take or witness an action that violates your values. When those things are sudden, like it was sudden or profound, which it was both sudden and profound in this situation I just described, that moral injury can occur where you feel like an injury on your soul. And moral distress and moral injury can pave the way to burnout. When we get to burnout, it can be difficult to hit reverse on what has happened. So these things can lead to that point. I want to hurry to say that moral distress, moral injury, and burnout, that they happen to good people who want to do good work, who are pressed into impossible situations over and over again. So it's common, not healthy, I would say, but it's common for us to feel guilty when we have moral distress and when we're burned out. But the truth is, it probably wasn't your fault. Would you have done things differently? Sure. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. But I want you to hear that moral distress, moral injury, and burnout, they happen to good people who want to do good work, who are put into impossible situations over and over